So I had a few questions in the past about how I did the waistcoat stitch for my Eras tour blanket. I do have a less in-depth reel about it, but I want to go through it in a bit more detail for you. So the stitch that I'm doing is called the waistcoat stitch, which gives you this kind of stacked variant sort of the stitch, so it looks more like knitting rather than the typical kind of slightly more tunneled look of the standard double crochet, the US single crochet. So I just wanted to show you how you can get this effect, because I just think it works really nicely. And yeah, you don't get that same sort of level of the stitches going into each other. So I'm just going to start. I'm going to be working on the back cross this time, so I'm just turning my work back over, and I'll just show you the back as well. So what I have done is I have wrapped all of my yarns around bobbins so that I don't get too tangled. Obviously, it's me, I still get tangled. But you just want to make sure that you can kind of fit your finger underneath your carries when you've got them coming across the back, so they're not too tight, because if they were too tight, you're going to get this sort of puckering and it would create, a tunnel in your work, so that it kind of gathered together and won't lay flat. So you just want to make sure that you can always kind of fit your finger underneath them. And yeah, I leave my ends, I tie them off and leave them there, as you may well know from my other content. I will be putting fabric on the back, so don't worry about that. Just going to work through the kind of tops of the first few stitches. Because I'm working in the black, it is really hard to see. So I will talk you through it anyway, just so that you know, but it is harder. So once we get into the other colours, it's easier to see that. So for this first stitch, I like to kind of go through the top of the stitch first, and then go through the bar of the stitch before it. It's really hard to show you because of the angle that I need to put my finger over it. But you will see when you twist the front towards you that there's actually a V on the front of the stitch, and then you're going back towards where you've just come from to go underneath it. It is much easier to do it that way for that end stitch, and you'll kind of see what I mean when I can show you on the lighter colours. But your waistcoat stitches worked, so you're going to go what is normally known as the back loop of the stitch. So when you are doing a standard single double crochet, you get that loop on the back of your work, and you normally get the kind of V look on the front and the pie symbol on the back. So it's that back loop that faces you when you're working back and forth, that allows you to then go underneath that to then go under the top of the stitch. So that's how I'm going. You're not going through the middle of anything, you're going underneath, like from the bottom up to the top, behind that back loop, just behind that back loop, then into the top of the stitch. So here you can see that I'm kind of doing that through the top of the stitch first, and then round to the post of the stitch. But as we get to the colours here, I will show you in a bit more detail, because it's just so hard to see when it's black on black. So in terms of the pattern itself, I'm using stitch fiddle, which means that I can track my rows, and I'm currently working back on myself, so I'm going from left to right rather than right to left, even though as I'm working right to left because of how crochet works for a right-handed person. So because I need to change colour, I'm going to start the beginning of this stitch with my black, and then the next colour is the grey. So I'm going to take the colour that I need, I can unwind it from my bobbin. So here you can see I've still got the 2 loops of this stitch on my hook, and I'm then going to get my next colour. So this is where the bobbins kind of come in handy, but it just goes to show they can also still get a bit twisted, and have you met me? Everything I do gets twisted. I end up in such a mess, even if I've got the bobbins, so I'm not even going to pretend that I don't still get in a tangle, but it's because I'm too lazy to tie the bobbins back together at the end of it. So don't worry if you think that that's going to be your problem, just make sure you always attach them back on. So now I have the right colour that I need, where I've got those 2 stitches, the 2 loops on my hook still, I'm going to yarn over with my new colour, and I want to make sure that the yarn that I'm leaving behind isn't too puckered. So I'm making sure that it's nice and loose. It is going to kind of sit over the next stitches, which can make it a bit difficult to see. So in those instances, sometimes I go through the top of the stitch, but here you can see I'm going through that back post of the stitch, essentially, that back loop. But it's not like the back loop of the top of the stitch, it's the back loop that's further down. So you aren't going through the top of the stitch until you've gone through that back loop. So now I'm having to change to my next colour again. This part is quite bitty. When it is just like 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 with your colour changes, you don't have to be quite so like, I can put my finger underneath, because that will give you lots of baggy loops, and you don't really want that either. But just make sure that when you're carrying your colours up, that you are giving yourself enough of like a leeway with it so that you can kind of, you know, it still doesn't pucker and doesn't pull. So now that I've changed that colour, you're doing that last yarn over and pulling that through because that creates the top of your next stitch. So here I find it difficult to see that stitch, so I've gone through the top of the stitch there, and as you can hopefully kind of see, it's really hard to show because I need to use my finger to like pull that stitch over, but that V that is the stitch that you're going through, it's back on yourself. So when you've stuck through the top, you kind of lean it backwards to go through that part of the V on the stitch that you're working on. It looks like it might be the previous stitch, but because of how you work a crochet stitch, the top of your stitch when you're working back and forth is to the left hand side. If you're left handed, it will be to the right. And so you'll be able to just keep keep that in mind as you go. The stitch that you're working on, you're working into the top left, and you have to go back on yourself in order to take yourself through them with that stitch. It can be quite difficult to do sometimes. It's really hard to get the hang of. The first couple of rows of the blanket when I was doing this, I hated myself for ages because it was so difficult. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to finish up this row because watching me do the whole thing is tedious, and then I'll come back and show you what it looks like when we're working with the right side facing us. So what ended up happening as I was working is I needed to add in a new colour, which is also a really useful thing to show you. So I have my new bobbin and have the new colour ready to go, and essentially all you're going to do is treat it as a normal yarn over. Leave yourself this yarn tail so you've got enough to be able to tie it together at the back, which I don't think I recorded any of, and then just keep going. So you've done that yarn over, so your yarn tail becomes like what is attached at the back, theoretically, in air quotes, and then you yarn over as normal, and then you can use that little tail to tie it together with at the end. Make sure you do leave yourself enough of a tail to do so, otherwise you under the thread a bit kind of poking through the front. I'm sure there are much more official ways to change colour than this, but this is what I've done on my entire blanket and it worked out well for me. So now we're going to skip to showing you it from the front. So you're going to start by doing a chain to do your turning chain. I like to do mine at the end of the row and then turn my work. So now you can see the front side. It makes a much neater image. You can actually see what's going on. You can see her hand. You can see her mouth starting to form. It's just, oh, it's so pleasing when you can see the image starting to form, and like that was the best thing about doing the blanket when you get all of these sections. So actually doing the Tortuous Poets apartment was much harder than doing Midnights, because on the Midnights tailor there's a lot more like signifiers throughout, so like her elbow was my favourite part of the entire thing, but now that I've done her hand here, it's so nice to see. So essentially what I'm going to do, and again it is quite difficult to show because it is the black, annoyingly I should have done it in a different colour, but you know, needs must. So to do that first one, I always find it easier to go underneath the top of the stitch first, and then I'm going back on myself to go underneath that bar of the V. I think the easiest way to show you is to kind of zoom in as much as I can, and I've slowed it down as well just to try and show you what I mean. So I'm going underneath the top of the stitch like you would normally, but before I'm finishing it, I'm leaning it back on myself. I have to use my finger to be able to pull over the part of the stitch, which is obviously not particularly helpful. But essentially, yeah, you'll go back on yourself and you'll be able to see that V. I'll show you again in a moment when we have a bit of a clearer colour as well. But I just wanted to show you this in this situation as well. And then essentially you kind of be working it in the same way, but instead of having your finishing yarn at the front of your work when you're done with it, when you're changing colour, you're dropping it at the back of your work, so that you're making sure that all of your strings are on that back side. So previously we pulled them forwards when we were working on the back, like working with the back facing us. We're always putting those yarn ends on the side that is the back of the work. So you want to make sure that you're dropping them at the back as you're going. There are definitely some stitches that are easier to do than others. Somewhere on the colour changes I find can get a little bit tighter, especially if it is attaching a new colour. It can get a little bit tighter and a bit harder to do, but do persevere with it. I do think it is absolutely worth it. When people ask me how long it took, obviously I'm saying 500 hours. It wouldn't have taken me 500 hours if I was doing a standard stitch, but because of that extra thing, I'm working in a cotton, which is not very forgiving in terms of like being able to stretch and everything else. It just makes the whole time add up. So yeah, when people are like, crochet faster, I'm like, you can't. I'm following, you're following a very complicated pattern, you're doing a very complicated stitch, and it will obviously work up a lot faster if you aren't doing this waistcoat stitch. So I am just going to do another kind of quick zoom in on the stitch here, just so you can kind of see what's going on the most clearly. So you're going to go in around this horizontal bar. So what is typically the back bar when it's facing you then when you're working back the other way. It's known as the back loop or like the back bump because it's on the back of your work when you're working it. So the stitches I'm doing now, I'm forming that back bump. But on the stitches that you're doing then when you're working back the other way, they become on the front of your work. So you're going to go underneath from the bottom up to the top, then through the top of your stitch. So, and then complete your stitch as normal. So we're going to hook, using our hook as a hook, we're going to hook underneath that stitch and push up and then through. You're then completing your stitch as you would a normal double crochet as well. So you're just taking those stitches and continuing with them. So again, here I am just changing colour, so I'm doing that on the last yarn over because it means that that yarn over will become the top of the next stitch. So as you can see here, I'm hooking up underneath that to then go through the top of the stitch and pull through and work my stitch as normal. And there we go, you just kind of carry on in the same way. I hope that was useful. Now we're going to have a look at the front. Here she is again, we can see her hand. Oh, she just looks so good. Yes, this is the exact same video that I used earlier, but I just wanted to have a look at it before I left you. I hope that was useful. If you have any questions, just give me a shout.